When I was in my early 20s, I used to work in a used bookstore. It was a quaint little store on a leafy street, popular with tourists. There were niche shops all along the boulevard, wide sidewalks, benches, and antique looking street lamps. The store itself was tiny, but packed with a unique selection of books you weren't likely to find anywhere else, including all sorts of books on mythology and ghost and fairy tales, my personal favorite topic. It was the type of place you could browse for hours, and you were guaranteed to come away with at least one incredible find. I loved the job. The owners of the store were a local couple, both friendly and easy to get along with. The only problem was this one coworker who I'll call Brenda. Brenda was the most senior person at the store apart from the owners, and whenever the owners weren't around, she would sort of declare herself in charge, even though I don't think the owners were aware she was doing that. There were a lot of things the owners weren't aware of when it came to Brenda. When they were around, Brenda was charming, friendly, funny. But whenever they weren't there, she would transform into a completely different person, a bully. She would yell at me or other less senior employees over the most trivial things. She would accuse us of purposely putting books back on the shelf in the wrong place, of tampering with her paperwork. She would demand we redo jobs we had already done, stand over our shoulders criticizing us while we were doing simple tasks. She was a nightmare. Several employees quit while I was there specifically because of Brenda. But the owners seemed to have a blind spot about her. They had known her for years, and she was so charming whenever they were around that they just couldn't see what she was. During this time, a stray cat had appeared one night at the back door of the shop, meowing and scratching to get in. It was a night when I was working alone with one of the owners. It was a cold, stormy night, and we were both cat lovers, so we let the cat inside and gave it some food and water. It was a black cat, a beautiful black cat with golden eyes, purring and affectionate. The next morning, I brought her to the vet to be checked out. She was healthy, but older. We put signs up in the neighborhood hoping someone would come and claim her, but in the meantime, we let her live in the store. And soon she became our store cat. We named her Mildred, Millie for short, after a character in a series of children's books called The Worst Witch. The customers loved her, and she seemed to love them. And pretty soon she was a fixture in that place, adding to the cozy ambiance. We couldn't imagine the store without her. But then there was the problem of Brenda. When the owners were around, Brenda mostly ignored the cat or pretended to like her. But when the owners weren't there, Brenda was as mean to the cat as she was to the rest of us. She would shoo the cat off surfaces, stomp her feet to spook her, and even make hissing sounds at her. And then one day I came to work, and Millie the cat was missing. I don't know how that cat could have gotten out, but I do know Brenda was the first person into work that day. She claimed she showed up for work, unlocked the door, and the cat wasn't there, even though she had been there the night before. I hoped Millie would find her way back to the store on her own, as cats often do. But as the weeks went by without any sign of her, I was starting to lose hope. I printed up some posters with a photograph of her and posted them around the neighborhood, but I didn't get any responses. Halloween rolled around. I was working that evening alone with Brenda. She was in a foul mood as usual, and the slightest thing kept setting her off. At one point, when she was yelling at me because she said I hadn't dusted a shelf properly, I finally snapped. I told her if she didn't like the way I dusted, she could do it herself. I quit, I said. grabbed my jacket and bag, and stormed out. Shaking all over, frustrated to the point of tears, I decided to go for a walk to calm myself down. The sun was setting, and there were kids out in their costumes already, trick-or-treating. I walked the neighborhood streets aimlessly, not really paying attention to where I was going. The dozens of complaints I had about Brenda were rolling around in my head. I hadn't really wanted to quit that job. I needed that job to pay my rent. I thought about calling the owners and explaining what had happened and hoping against hope that they would believe me instead of Brenda. Then I started thinking about Millie, wondering where she was and hoping she was okay and just wishing I could find her. This was about the time I realized that I had no idea where I was. I didn't recognize the street I was on at all. It was a pretty street with rows of white houses, raised duplexes with stairs leading to the front doors. But there was something strange about the street. For one thing, it was empty. There weren't any trick-or-treaters or even any cars parked along the boulevard. And none of the houses were decorated for Halloween. It was getting dark. The houses were dark. Not one of them had a light on in the window. There was something eerie about it, like no one actually lived on this street, like it was a film set or display houses for a building company. I doubled back, tried to retrace my steps. I'd only been about a quarter of the way down the street when I realized I didn't know where I was, so I should have been able to find my way to a familiar street pretty quickly. At least this is what I had assumed. But when I moved off this street onto the adjacent one, I realized I didn't recognize this street at all either. This street was busy. Not just busy, it seemed like there was some sort of street festival going on. There were lights everywhere and street vendors and crowds of people milling around. Now, I know I had been lost in my thoughts, but there's no way I would have walked through a street festival and not noticed it. I had retraced my steps. There was no way I could have ended up on the street with the white houses without passing through this street festival. But maybe it was just that I was upset, I tried to convince myself. Maybe there hadn't been as many people here when I'd walked down the street earlier. Maybe that's why I hadn't noticed the festival. Well, I was here anyway. At least I could ask someone where I was and for directions. I started walking towards one of the street vendors when someone grabbed me by the wrist. "You're not supposed to be here," said a grizzled old voice. I turned around. An old lady was holding me by the wrist. She was wild looking with long, frizzy black and white hair and flowing, sort of witchy clothing. "I'm lost," I told her, and asked for directions to the nearest major street. "Fortune first," she said, and cocked her head. Behind her was a vendor stand and a sign that said tarot readings. I asked her how much it was, and she said there was no charge, that it was all part of the fun. So I figured, why not? She led me over to her stand, which was just a table with a elaborate tablecloth draped over it and a couple of chairs. She still had hold of my wrist. Her nails were sharp. But she was an old lady, and I didn't want to be rude, so I didn't complain. At the stand, she pulled out her cards and began to shuffle. "Do you have a question before the end?" "Before the end?" I repeated. She smiled, and I noticed that her teeth were unusually sharp looking. While you still live and breathe, the woman said. You never know how long that'll be. I guess, I said, feeling a little creeped out. So I asked the first question that popped into my head. My cat Millie recently went missing, I said, and I'd like to know where she is and if she's okay. The old woman narrowed her eyes. Your cat? She repeated and asked what Millie looked like. I still had a couple of posters with Millie's photo on them in my bag, so I pulled one out and handed it to the woman. She took one look at the poster, glared at me, and then told me to wait there. And she got up and left, weaving her way through the crowd. Okay, that was weird, I thought. It was dark now, but the street was lit up with festive lanterns. After a few minutes of waiting for the woman to come back, I decided it was best to slip away. There was something off about that woman, and I really wanted to get back to somewhere familiar. I got up and wandered through the crowd looking for someone who looked friendly and might give me directions. But the more I actually looked at the people attending this festival, made eye contact with them, the more uneasy I became. There was something wrong about them. The way they moved, gracefully and noiselessly, the way they would stop and stare at me with intense, concentrated eyes. I didn't want to ask any of them for directions. I didn't want to speak to them. I just wanted to get out of there. I moved through the crowd in search of a street sign. As I walked, the smells of cooking meat wafted all around me. I saw a chubby man with shaggy hair grilling fish at a stand. He was licking his lips and grinning wide. For a moment, as I passed, I could have sworn I saw a tail, like a cat's tail, swinging behind him. Then I saw a woman grilling what looked like a row of small birds on a shish kebab, and another man grilling what looked like mice. It's too bad, I heard someone say. She's so young. A shame, someone else said. One wrong turn. I walked quickly, looking for some way, any way to get off this street and away from this festival and these people. It was Halloween, I kept telling myself. There wasn't anything unusual about this festival. It was completely normal. And yet I couldn't believe this, no matter how many times I repeated it. None of these people were wearing costumes, and I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Swishing cat-like tails, sharp teeth, vaporous, translucent forms screaming for help. Then someone grabbed me by my wrist. I spun around. A young woman was standing there holding onto my wrist. She was beautiful. More beautiful than anyone I'd ever seen in real life. She was dressed in a flowing black dress and had long dark hair and strange eyes that were kind of golden when the light hit them. You shouldn't be here, she said. In a spill of words, I told her how I'd been distracted and I'd lost my way and I didn't know where I was and all I wanted was to go home. She hardly moved as I spoke. When I'd run out of words, she said, You were kind to me, so I will help you. Follow me. And she turned and began to move gracefully through the crowd. I followed because I didn't know what else to do. But I didn't know what she was talking about when she said I had been kind to her. As far as I knew, we'd never met before. I kept as close as I could to the woman. As we moved, eyes glared, and I could hear soft hissing sounds coming from every direction. I heard the word hunt and saw people running along rooftops. The beautiful woman led me to a dark side street. This street was connected to the main street where the festival was. It was long and dark and lined with white houses. It looked just like the street with the white houses I had been on earlier. "This can't be the way," I said, but she ignored me. "Follow the road quickly," she said, "and don't look back, no matter what you see or hear. If you feel threatened, use this." She put something in my hand. It felt like a small rock. "Go now," she said. "When you cross the water, you will be safe." I told her I didn't understand. There wasn't any water around here. I asked her to please explain what was going on. She smiled faintly, and once more she thanked me for my kindness. She said she would never forget it, but that she was safe now, and I didn't need to look for her anymore. I had never been more confused. I was sure I had never met this woman before, and I certainly hadn't been looking for anyone, well, except for Millie. And then it hit me. How much the strange golden color of this woman's eyes reminded me of the cat. "You must go now," she said with an urgency that scared me, "or else a part of you will remain with us forever." I didn't want to wait around to figure out what that meant. I turned and bolted down the street with the white houses. It was dark. There weren't any streetlights or any lights in the neat rows of houses. As I ran, I heard hissing sounds and growls, and I had a sense I was being followed, chased. To my left, a garbage can fell over and rolled onto the street. A bush shook to my right. Something scratched my arm. I was panicking. I held up the rock the woman had given me because I didn't know what else to do. I heard hissing sounds in the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I could see eyes staring at me from the shadows. I kept running and did not turn around, just as the woman had instructed. The street ended at another cross street. There was a sign that said Water Street. "Cross the water," the woman said. I dashed across the street, and the moment I reached the other side, everything changed. There were streetlights again, and families trick-or-treating. Everything looked normal. I took a chance and looked back. As far as I could tell, nothing and no one had followed me. The street I was on now was small, and I wasn't familiar with it, but I did recognize the street at the end of the block. Soon I was back in familiar territory. I knew where I was, and I knew how to get home. But something strange and possibly supernatural had just happened to me, and I didn't know what to make of it. When I got home, I realized two things. My arms were covered in what appeared to be cat scratches, and I was still clutching the rock the woman had given me in my right hand. I opened my palm and found I was holding some sort of jewel. It looked like a diamond to me, but I don't know much about diamonds, so I couldn't tell for sure. The next day, I spoke to one of the owners of the bookstore on the phone. I told him everything that had happened with Brenda, how cruel she was to me and the other employees whenever the owners weren't around, how she was even mean to the cat. The owner thanked me for telling him the truth. He said he valued me as an employee and wanted me to come into the store the following week and talk things out with him and Brenda. I was reluctant. I didn't want to work things out with Brenda. I never wanted to see her again. But I did need the job, and the owners had always been so good to me, so I felt I owed it to them to at least try to work things out. Before I went in for the meeting, on a whim, I stopped at a local jeweler's and asked if they could appraise my stone. The man who worked there was friendly, and he agreed to take a look. As he examined it, he went silent and serious. He said it was indeed a diamond, and that it was at least 4 carats, whatever that meant, and that it could be worth as much as $100,000. $100,000? I was drinking water at the time and almost spit all over the counter. I couldn't believe it. Why would that woman have given me a $100,000 diamond? The jeweler gave me some advice on how to get an official grading report on the diamond, something I'd never even heard of before, and how I might auction it off. Me? Auction off a diamond? I couldn't believe this was happening. In a daze, I walked to the bookstore for my meeting with Brenda and the store owners. Before we could even start to talk about Brenda and the problems we'd been having, I told the owners everything that had happened on Halloween night. How I'd gotten lost and ended up in some sort of street festival. How strange everything was, and how a woman I didn't know gave me a diamond that turned out to be worth a lot of money. The owners were happy for me. They hugged me and congratulated me on my luck. One of the owners told me not to wonder about it, that there were things in this world that we didn't understand, and I should just be grateful and use the money well. It's what Millie would want, one of the owners said. And in that moment, something clicked for me. Something that had occurred to me briefly on that night, but was too crazy to believe. I thought that somehow that woman I met in the festival was Millie the cat. The whole time I was sharing my story, Brenda sat there looking sullen and angry. The only thing she said was, "Water Street? I know where that is. How could you possibly get lost around Water Street?" I didn't reply. I told the owners I would take a break at least for a little while I figured things out. About a week later, while I was out and about, I bumped into one of my colleagues from the bookstore. "Did you hear what happened to Brenda?" he said. "No, what happened?" I asked. "Apparently she went missing for like 3 days," he said. "Her husband was searching everywhere for her. Eventually he got a text from her and went to pick her up. He said he found her in an alley, surrounded by stray cats. Her husband said he thinks she had some kind of break with reality. She's barely spoken since then, and she's not working anymore at the bookstore." What? I was shocked. I never liked Brenda, but I didn't wish something like that on her. My colleague said he felt the same way. He didn't wish ill on Brenda, but had to admit the store was a lot more pleasant without her there. "I feel guilty even saying so," he said. I knew what he meant, and didn't really blame him for it. I told him I would see him later, and we both went our separate ways. But then I stopped him. "The alley with the cats where Brenda was found. Do you know where it is?" I asked him. He said he wasn't sure exactly, but it was off a small street about 15 minutes from here. He couldn't remember the name. "Was it Water Street?" I asked. "Oh yeah, that's it," he said. "How did you know?" How indeed. Though I had no desire to risk a repeat of what had happened to me that night, I decided to return to Water Street during the day to try to find the alley where Brenda had been found. I did find the alley. It was the only alley connected to Water Street. And it was exactly where I thought the street had been, with the white houses. There was no such street there now, not that I could find. But at the end of the alley was another longer alley that led behind rows of white houses, and eventually out onto an empty lot. there wasn't anything unusual about any of it, although it did feel strangely familiar to me, as if I'd been there before, even though I hadn't. But where had I been that night? I had a feeling I was never going to know the answer to that question, and that this was probably for the best. As I walked away, I heard the soft purring of a cat. Deciding to respect Millie's wishes, I didn't look back. Thanks for watching. This story was inspired by several different classic fairy tales from Ireland and Japan. Those stories are Yokiko and the Little Black Cat from Japan, and The Dance of the Dead, The Demon Cat, and Legends of Innis-Sark, as told by Lady Wilde from Ireland. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you have a wonderfully spooky All Hallows Eve. Special thanks to all my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. You can also support this work by making a one-time donation on PayPal or Ko-fi, becoming a member of the channel, or clicking the thanks button below this video. If you have a fairy story to share, whether a true experience or a work of fiction, you can either send it to me by email, which is in the description, or you can visit my website at scaryfairygodmother.com and submit your stories, comments, questions, or suggestions there. You can also sign up for my mailing list there. It's free to join. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're new, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.